Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy. As you can see, I am joined here with Dan Norton. Dan is a PhD in philosophy and he is a Randian. We are going to be debating Ayn Rand's ethical philosophy, specifically on the topic of egoism. I imagine we'll be going into the metaphysical weeds. So, hello, Dan. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, I'm getting an echo. I need to turn off my audio from YouTube. Okay. Sorry, did you just tell me to introduce myself?
I did.
Okay. Sorry, I was getting a double take in my ear. My name is Dan Norton. I have a PhD in philosophy. I am a big fan of Ayn Rand's philosophy, and I have a YouTube channel, which I believe is linked in the description, which I use to promote Ayn Rand's ideas. So appreciate the opportunity to come on and speak with you.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, before this, I was actually saying that my experience with Rand is surface level, I would say. Like, I've read The Virtue of Selfishness, I've engaged with Atlas Shrugged a bit, but I wouldn't say that I'm a Randian by any means, or even an expert in Rand. So, would you like to explain to the audience the a nice overview of Ayn Rand's ethical philosophy or ethical political philosophy?
Okay, sure. So in a nutshell, she has a philosophy of reason, egoism, and capitalism, but I can expand on any part of that. So you asked about the ethical and political aspects. So ethically, she's in favor of egoism, but not a sort of brute Nietzschean sacrifice other people to yourself sort of egoism. That's the sort of egoism which many people think of when they hear the word egoism, but she believes that someone should pursue his own interest, but not by sacrificing others to himself. So one should respect the rights of other individuals. Other individuals also should be egoists. Everyone should be trying to pursue their own happiness, but in a way that's harmonious with other people's pursuit of happiness. And a way to pursue your own happiness and increase your chances of achieving it is to respect other people's rights. If I'm a jerk to other people, if I'm rude, if I rape, rob, and murder others, I'm going to be at war with other people. And that's going to make my life worse than if I try to exist in a rights respecting sort of way, in a benevolent sort of way, in harmony with other people. So that's a little on her ethical views. Politically, she favors capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism. So the state should be restricted to protecting people from physical force. So if someone steals your money, goes around robbing, raping, murdering, all those things are outlawed under her system. But what the government does is it steps in, stops those people, but it doesn't rob one person and give his money to another. So as long as you're not initiating force against other people, you should be left free. And then you can, all individual interactions should be voluntary instead of coercive. And that's essentially her view of political relations. And I could talk a lot more about that, but I'll just stop there for now.
Yeah, that was a nice overview. Yeah, so I guess I'll just from that, let's just jump straight into it. I guess the questions that I have in relation to this philosophy is one, like, where do we derive our own moral good from? Like, how do we understand ourselves and what is good for us? And then two, it would be I know that she denounces what she calls moral cannibalism, where people do backbite and try to use each other as essentially as a way to achieve their own ends or their own perceived ends. Why would that necessarily be wrong, and what is wrong about it from a Randian position?
About using others to achieve your own ends?
Mm-hmm.
Well, depending on what you mean by that, I don't think that there's a problem with using others. So if what you mean is, for instance, you go to a store and you use the people there selling you goods, let's say you go to a grocery store, you want to buy some food. Well, am I using them? Well, in a way, I mean, I'm using them as a way to get food, but if I interact with them properly, I give them something in exchange. So they're also using me. So I give them money, they give me food. So it's a voluntary transaction to mutual benefits. And in a sense, we're both using each other, but not in a way that's uh, bad for either of us. It's a win-win sort of transaction. So that's the kind of
But what about rape or murder, as you said? Like, what would be wrong for Rand in those specific cases?
rape and murder. So those are coercive ways of dealing with other individuals. You're doing something against their consents, and that's not a way of interrelating with others that's conducive to your own well-being long range. So she doesn't believe in a brute sort of animalistic moment to moment momentary sort of existence. She thinks it's best for your own happiness and well-being to consider the long run consequences of your actions. And if you go around raping and murdering people, you're putting yourself at war with others, and that's not good for your long run happiness and well-being. That's likely, if I go around murdering, someone's going to want to stop me, put an end to it, maybe throw me in jail, maybe execute me, give me the death penalty, and that's certainly not good for my well-being. If I'm a rapist,
It's
who's
purely
going to want to be my girlfriend if she knows I'm going to rape people? So go ahead.
I was going to say, so is it purely for like sort of self-interested motives in the first? So you wouldn't do it because ultimately some other conclusion which is worse for you will occur, like some sort of consequence will occur for you. Is that the main thrust of the argument? Because
Yeah.
I mean that sort of begs the question why, let's say, a political ruler would be, or someone who had a considerable amount of power would respect someone who could not, let's say, enact some sort of vengeance or sort of bring me to justice. If there was no, let's say, like even it's cross-cultural, I'm murdering and raping in a way that is, let's say, we meet an alien species and we're on a planet that's uninhabited except for me and this other person. Nobody else knows we're there. Why should I not rape or murder them?
Okay, so you mentioned a couple sorts of examples. So the alien example, and then the dictator sort of example.
Mm-hmm.
So to go one at a time, I guess starting with the dictator. So I think if you're a dictator, your hold on power is plausibly precarious. So you might you're in constant danger of assassination. And you just look at history, you can see that someone who assumes power in a dictatorial sort of way is often overthrown in some kind of coup. Maybe they're executed a few years after they get into power. Even if they're not overthrown, there's this constant threat of being overthrown. So I don't think it's very conducive to a good internal mental state to know you're constantly under threat because you're treating other people like garbage or worse. They have an incentive to stop that and to attack you, to somehow put an end to it. And then aside from whether you're caught, I think it's plausible that someone will feel rotten about himself. I don't think you can respect yourself if you treat others as garbage.
Why would you say that? Is there a reason for that? Is a metaphysical reason, or are you just relying upon, let's say, like ordinary, what you take to be like ordinary mental states, like something that is, you think, just sort of fundamentally human?
Just 1 second before they answer that, I'm getting little notification things that produce a sound every few seconds. Sometimes, are you hearing that?
No.
Okay, good. I'll just try to ignore it on my end, but I'm glad that at least you're not hearing it.
Okay, so sorry. Okay. So yeah. So like, I'm just wondering, is this like some sort of moral sense where, so for example, if someone hasn't got a conscience in relation to what they're doing, let's say they see, like with the alien example, they see the person they're engaging with as subhuman, you know, why should they? Or they, let's say that they are, let's say there is a racial difference, like a special, like a kind of there's a difference in sort of capacities, capabilities that are necessarily the case, like between humans and animals, for example, or between humans and disabled people, like as a class, like mentally disabled. Let's say that this group of individuals in this society are held in contempt. They're not held with any sort of public adoration or compassion. And people simply abuse them for their own amusement. They're like when people used to go and see the mad get whipped. They'd go like into asylums and they'd go and go and watch the mad. Like why would what would Rand say was wrong about that, or would she say there was anything wrong about that?
I think so. I think she would say there's something sick and twisted about taking pleasure in another being's suffering. It's one thing to derive some kind of advantage from it, like eating meats. I know you talk a lot about vegetarianism, or have done that.
Veganism, yeah.
Or veganism, yeah. So it's one thing to kill an animal for the food of it. You derive some sort of benefits, but if it's just for the sake of watching it suffer, you're not even trying to benefit from it. I think there's something corrupt about that, and I think it's probably a sign of an unhealthy psychological state.
But what's unhealthy about it? Like, because health, it being a standard, like you're gonna have to make an argument that there is that there is some sort of either like that, as in like a human psychology is necessarily going to be in detriment from this sort of dispositional relation to others, or that it is conducive of something which is necessarily detrimental to the individual, where like, so for example, the mental state itself is a form of suffering. So what would you say, like, in that respect? Like, what is this psychological harm? Don't get me wrong, I think it's completely horrible. I wouldn't advocate for it. I would certainly advocate against it. So I mean, it's just wondering what Rand would say.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there might be people who, maybe you could call them psychopaths, who there's no way to fix it. I'm not sure about that, but
I don't think you need to go into the psychopath thing. Like this, like for example, most of the Nazis in World War II, like a lot of them did some nasty stuff. There's people in Ukraine that'll be doing some nasty stuff right now. These won't be like psychologically, I think, too distinguished from the ordinary individual in society. I think that the capacities for human sadism is like in everyone. Everyone's capable of being sadistic.
Right. So set aside the psychopath sort of case. Just talk about a normal human
just
psychology.
A normal guy. Yeah, like yeah. So like with psychopaths, it kind of implies there's something broken in the first place, doesn't it? Like it's as if there's something abnormal going on. This person's not functioning correctly. What about just your ordinary individual, like the person that just they do feel for people, but they don't feel for these people, or at least what they feel about these people, they gain gratification rather than disgust at certain acts done against them.
Right. So what's wrong with that? I'm not sure what to say of like initially, but I would want to know why is it that they are taking pleasure in another being's suffering? I mean, if you're on the premise of trying to pursue happiness and your own well-being and harmony with other people, like how does it benefit you in any way that some other being is suffering?
It's pleasure, not the benefit itself.
Well, I mean, you can get pleasure from doing drugs or having alcohol, but if there's some kind of long run cost to that, then I think that should be factored in. So I guess, so I mean, am I going to want to be friends with somebody who takes pleasure in needless suffering of other human beings or animals? I don't think so. I'm going to want to shun that person. I'm going to try to ostracize that person from my life. So I guess that's one problem.
I mean, I guess, but I mean, what happens when it's a community of people and, they do have friends and, I think that it's one of those things where I guess it comes down to, why do we take pleasure in anything? And what is the correct thing to take a pleasure in is the sort of heart of the question that I'm kind of trying to metaphysically sort of push us towards like what is a correct desire, or correct pleasure, and what is an incorrect one, and why, from a Randian perspective.
Yeah, I think a correct pleasure would be one that integrates with your life as a whole, with your long run well-being. And I think if you're talking about the sort of person that does take pleasure in something like cruelty to animals, I don't think that integrates with their long run well-being and happiness.
But why?
Well, I mean, there's the so I gave this sort of consideration a minute ago about I'm not going to want to interact with that sort of person, so I'm going to shun them, isolate them. So you might think they're going to be isolated, but then you brought up the case of, well, what if there's a whole community of
Yeah, there's
people like
hunters, for example.
this?
There's communities of hunters and stuff, and there's communities of like there's communities of people who enjoy blood sports, for, you know what I mean, like there's communities everywhere. So it's like one of those things. It's like, yeah, and you know, you that's not even considering like what if this person is less social. They might be them, I mean, they're probably going to be antisocial anyway. So like when we're talking about how they engage with people in the first place, they might want to be friends with someone who's not disagreeable, who's not willing to um essentially engage in violence, you know, like neo-Nazi gangs and stuff like that. That might be their like community.
Yeah. Just a second. I'm going to try to turn off my Discord because these notifications I'm getting every few seconds are really distracting. So if I shut down Discord, that's not going to end this call because we're on Zoom, I believe. So
I hope it
that,
doesn't anyway.
all right, let me just try that. Hold on a second. Okay, you still hear me? We're still here.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, so yeah,
Okay.
so like I'm just wondering what the metaphysics. So like when we're talking about like standards and like something being harmonious with your life in the first place, we'll have to understand like, well, what is a good pleasure? What is a bad pleasure? I mean, you could have a harmonious life full of like in theory, it could be an internally consistent um life in which an individual takes pleasure from sadistic acts. Those sadistic acts are they have friends, they have family. There's people like this that exist. Um, like they do what we would consider antisocial actions, but only so far as it brings them um uh advantage, even social advantage. Like let's say like they intimidate others, like they actively engage in like forms of intimidation to gain social and political advantage. And as such, they've managed to position themselves as a community figurehead. Like these kind of situations seem to be um, antithetical to the notion that simply being violent is going to lead you to an unhappy life if happiness is just pleasure. So I'm just wondering what like is there like how do we if happiness is just pleasure, right? If it's just your experiences of positive and negative stimuli, how do we differentiate what is a good one and a bad one if that itself is the standard?
Well, if you think one is long range going to be more sustainable, then that would be the one to go for. So if you think a certain policy, so I think it's different with animals and humans. I think it's less sustainable in the long run to put yourself at war with other human beings because they can fight back, as opposed to animals. You know, dogs, chickens. You could spend your life torturing animals and get together with some friends and spend your whole life in your little community of friends who likes to torture animals. I guess that could be sustainable. I don't think it's sustainable when you're putting yourself at war, or at least it's less likely to be sustainable in the long run to put yourself at war with other people.
Doesn't have to be a war. Remember, like you get cult leaders, for example, where they're worshipped. You get, I mean, Machiavelli's Prince. He sees fear as a tool to maintain political prowess. So, like, why is it that, for example, you would say that this is less sustainable anyway, when someone like Machiavelli might respond with, actually, this is how you make a sustainable environment for your own will to flourish, for your own to enact your own desires.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that he would be correct in asserting that his mode of being is sustainable. I mean, we can look at history for examples of people who try to pursue power, and as I've already mentioned, they're often overthrown by the next guy who wants power. And even if they're not overthrown, they're under constant threat of being overthrown. So they live with that fear because they know they're acting in a way that's other people.
Differentiate it. You could, for example, you could make it a little bit more sustainable. And this is what Machiavelli does, doesn't he? He proposes a form of constitutional government, but at the head is a monarch. And so it's you still have inordinate amount of power in certain individuals, but you also have a more diverse power structure, which limits perhaps the monarch's power, but creates a more sustainable environment. The same thing can be said with let's take I think the Roman Senate. Obviously, the Roman Senate is notoriously bloodthirsty and they'll kill you. But if you work with the Senate, they could actually be your greatest allies. So, like Marcus Aurelius, for example, he seemed to live a pretty decent life. He seemed to have a lot of power. I mean, someone like Emperor Caligula, maybe you would be right about that. You know, he went mad from the threats of people wanting to kill him and stuff like that. And but there seems to be plenty of Roman emperors who ruled correctly, or ruled in such a way as it to not have to worry so much of assassination, but have an inordinate amount of power, and be able to fulfill their whims. I'm just wondering, and even that doesn't even take into consideration things like secrecy, things like class-based structures. You know, a slave class, for example, where you have a community, a conscious community separation, where we associate only with a collective, with one part of the collective and not the other. So I'm just wondering why, so for example, in Nazi Germany, when if you're part of a system where people are murdering the mentally disabled, let's say you're someone who really enjoys that, how is this going to come back on you? Or like slave owners.
Yeah. So you're murdering people who are mentally disabled. I mean,
because I think it's wrong necessarily. I think inherently wrong. I think that what you're doing is wrong, and I will argue that from a place of metaphysics, like metaethics. But it seems to me that you've got to make the point of going, this will lead you to have a bad life, and I'm trying to posit a scenario in which actually it might not actually come back to bite you on the arse. You might get away with your horrific crimes. Like Jimmy Savile, for example, no one came out when he was alive. Right? His reputation's destroyed, but he's dead.
Okay, I don't know who that is. I'm not familiar with that. Example.
A horrible pedophile who was the public figure in the United Kingdom.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just putting myself in this sort of position, and you use this you said, how would it come back to bite you? But in my case, I don't think it even would have to come back. I mean, it's already there from the moments I treat someone like that. I think I would feel guilty.
You sound like a well brought up person, right? Right? You can't use that as a justification. You can't appeal to your own psychological state. Because Rand, it's a fundamental nature, isn't it? Like, she appeals to life, in the virtue of selfishness. So I'm just wondering, what about our vital interests would alienate us from doing violence to one another, or prevent or motivate us to not perform violent acts against one another, if we take the individual, if we take the self to be purely particularized, which is what I think she does. She takes it to be very individual to the person. The good is to the good of specific members of society and not a collective.
Yeah. So I was thinking that maybe if I use myself, I could then sort of unravel what the reasoning is and then extrapolate from that and apply it to other individuals. So I think in my own case, I would feel guilty if I treated others in this cruel sort of way. So then one could ask, well, why feel guilty? And then if I can substantiate that with reasons, then perhaps those reasons would apply equally to others.
Okay, so why feel guilty then? If you think that guilt is the sort of is a rational position, then you're saying like if you are rational, you will feel guilty. So so give us your reasons for why someone should feel guilty.
Yeah, so I think that's the more challenging part. So the easy part is to say I would feel guilty. I just projecting how I think I would feel in that scenario. Yeah, I think I would feel very guilty. Maybe to the point where I would want to just turn myself into the police or kill myself if I killed somebody else, because otherwise it would just haunt me for the rest of my life. So why would it be so troubling to me?
Give credit to your parents who seem to have raised you well, at least.
or maybe partly to
yourself.
that, maybe partly to myself for the thinking that I've chosen to do about these sorts of issues, which no one forced me to do. Just because you're raised by certain parents doesn't mean you're going to be determined to have certain ideas. You could have conflicting ideas. They could raise you religiously. And
apparently Ted Bundy's parents were actually fairly decent. So, you've raised you come through your parents, I think was the best way I heard it described. They don't make you, children move through you. And I think it's an environmental, it's like I think that you're right there. But it's just more of the fact, like, obviously I think Aristotle would have called this like a crate, wouldn't he? It's like you've essentially internalized good values, like virtues. And so they've limited in a way which is beneficial to you your habits and your desires. And I think that's the kind of argument you're trying to make. I guess the issue is like, obviously Aristotle appeals to an essential nature where he says like, look, this is why humans should behave like this. Whereas I don't think Rand does that. She appeals to the ego, and the ego itself, it has an essential nature. It's like there is a life here, but she doesn't really, from what I'm aware, she doesn't expand upon what our nature is and why we should care about others, other than simply caring about our own satisfaction and our own pleasure over time, even.
Yeah, well, I mean, she does, as I think she thinks we should care about others, certain others, not all others. I mean, if somebody's a dictator, you might want to destroy that person. But again, that's also because it's in your own interest to do so. Likewise, she would say it's in your interest to respect other people's rights. So maybe partly there's a question. I mean, as an individual, you face a choice of how you're going to relate to other individuals. If you want to live in society and reap the benefits of society, I think there's a lot of benefits to be reaped in a proper society. Like if you're a Jew in a Nazi society, then your interest might consist of getting out of society. You might be better off living alone, isolated. But if you're in a rights respecting free society, like more like the United States, I would say, then it is in your interest to be in society. So I think as an individual, you face the question of, how should I relate to other individuals? Should I relate to them as a trader, trading value for value? Like the grocery store example I gave before, you give them money, they give you food. It's a win-win sort of relation. Or do you want to have a exploiter and exploited sort of relationship? A war of all against all, as Thomas Hobbes put it. Well, maybe that sort of life would be nasty, brutish, and short. I think it would. So I think
Hobbes himself argues for what I think you'd probably consider tyranny.
Maybe so. If you have an all-powerful state, Leviathan.
And the sovereign is the soul, the rational principle from which the movement of the Leviathan is derived.
Yeah, I doubt.
That is what he sees as so like if I became the sovereign, like why can't I, like there is a point in which I think you would say it would be irrational for the sovereign, so it would be like cutting off your own finger. But at the same time, like if I see even the good of myself and the body of the people, as in cutting off what I see as a less useful part of it. Let's say Aristotle, when he argues that children who are severely disabled should be killed. They're a drain on society. Would you say, like, I'm assuming you would think that was wrong? The large amount of society, let's say, agrees with Aristotle in this situation. You are the sovereign. You want to kill them because it makes your state stronger, makes you stronger, and it provides you political stability. Are you wrong?
So I don't think it is true that you will be stronger if you kill people who are disabled. If that's the example, I'm not familiar with that example from
Severely.
Aristotle.
I think it's severely disabled. I think that it's, so for example, it's someone, and I agree in some respects that there is a point in which you could absorb it, but I think that it's going to cost you resources. You're going to need people to care for them. You're also going to need I think there's advantages too, which is compassion. But let's say you have limited resources at this point in time. Why not kill them?
Well, there are what you might call lifeboat cases. Ayn Rand has an article called "The Ethics of Emergencies," where she might be discussing the sort of case you have in mind. So, if you're on a lifeboat and it can only hold one person, but there are two people on it, then in a sense there's limited resources, there's limited space for survival. So in that sort of scenario, you would be justified in trying to throw the other person overboard in order to save yourself. But we don't live in lifeboats. We don't live in that sort of zero-sum world where one person can only gain at the expense of someone else. Normally, if we're not in an emergency sort of situation, we can survive in harmony with other people, and we don't need to kill, exploit other people.
It just seems that this harmony is accidental. That there's nothing built into it. Like, as in, it so happens that my interests may harmonize with you, and they may harmonize with others, and they may even do so the majority of the time. But if we fall into disharmony, then I am justified in any action against you, it seems.
Well, I think maybe we need to fill in the details here more. So as a general rule, I think it's not in your interest to coerce, to use physical force against other people. It's in your interest to respect others' rights, let them act as they choose to act, engage with them voluntarily.
What about
other exceptions to that, like the lifeboat case that I gave, but I think those are exceptions. So I just think in general, we should respect others' rights. That's the most harmonious way to interact with other human beings.
But what do you even mean by rights as well? So this is like, I'm going to start trying to push back on your metaphysics. So what do you even mean by rights? Well, okay. What is right?
So in Rand's view, the rights are our rights to be free from physical force. So the more fundamental concept here is force or coercion, so the initiation of force is another phrase that she sometimes uses. That's what she's against. Starting the use of force. It's okay to use force in self-defense. That would be a retaliatory use of force. But starting the use of force against other people is what sorry, I just changed my can you still hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, sorry, I got a message saying my headphone had changed. So what she opposes is initiating force. She's not against using force in retaliation or self-defense. And if you do initiate force, that's when she thinks you're violating someone's rights. So if I try to rob you, take your stuff without your consent.
That's tautological. It seems like you have a right to not be coerced, and that you are being being coerced breaches your rights. Do you know what I mean? Like, why is this a right? What fundamentally makes this a right? And what's different? Like, for example, if I have a desire not to be, right? We haven't even got to the point of the people that do desire to be physically coerced. I mean, like, that's not even.
Well, if they desire, then are they really being coerced? Is it, if this is what they want,
No, they could be
does it
wrong
really
about what
count
they
as?
want. So they could believe that they are right, that they understand themselves correctly when they misunderstand themselves. They hurt me, but then as masochistically as they think is good for them, but they might actually be wrong about that. So, like, they might be wrong against their own desires, even their own preferences. And then also, what I'm really considering is just what makes this a right and not just a desire. Anyway, but
Yeah.
what is fundamental about this that just makes it like we would go so far as to say this is the rights of all citizens. This is universal as well. This is in every single individual.
Yeah. So she bases her view of rights on the nature of man. So in her view, the nature of human beings is such that they survive by reason. Reason is the basic means of survival. So by thinking, we're able to produce all the amazing technology that we have today. But reason cannot function under force. So a gun is not an argument.
Oh, I mean,
Galileo going before the Catholic Church is a
reason
classic
can
example of this. You know,
reason
they
can
they
a force though, can't it? Because like you could, it depends on. Sorry to interrupt, but it depends on whether you're the one holding the gun, right? Like, so if you got a gun to someone else, your reasoning might be working fine, their reasoning might not. So like the point, I guess, of what I'm trying to aim at when you say nature, the nature of man, is that nature particular to each and every individual man, or is it common and universal, like a species that Aristotle would argue? I guess there's something specifically that is inherent that we share. Do you know what I mean? Or is this individualized? Like, am I just like talking about individual psychologies?
well, I think maybe it's both. I mean, everyone in the species, all individuals of the species, man or human being or Homo sapien, has a rational capacity. I mean, there might be very rare exceptions on the margin, psychopaths who can't be rational, but setting that aside, uh, all members of the species human being have a rational capacity, and that capacity cannot function under force,
What is
under
so?
code.
What is this nature then? Like, that like, do I partake in this nature? Is this nature? Do I understand what my nature is against myself, or do I understand it against some sort of universal? So, like, for example, if I was understanding what was right and wrong, is it right and wrong against like my personal nature, or is it right and wrong against human nature? Like, simplicity.
Well, I mean, I think certainly the former, but the former or the latter is exemplified in the former. I mean, you are a human, I am a human, you know, billions of other people are humans, and we all have a similar nature. We're not identical in every respect, but we're similar in that we all have a rational capacity, and we're also similar in that force negates and paralyzes that rational capacity.
How so?
Okay, so if there's two parts of that, and negates and paralyzes. Ayn Rand uses that phrase, or a very similar phrase. So how does force negate the minds? Well, if I use my minds to be productive, I go to work and I I'm a computer programmer, let's say, and I spend my days writing code, and then I do all this mental work, and I'm able to, in exchange for that, draw a paycheck. And so I get my paycheck. Say I get a few $1,000s every week for doing this, and then you come along and you rob my bank account, or you hack my bank account and take all the money that I earned. Well, you've negated my mind in the sense that all that mental work I put in to producing that wealth is now worthless to me. So my mind has become useless to me. In my mind is my tool of survival. Humans survive by their minds, by their reason, according to Rand. But you make that survival tool impotent. So animals, they survive by brute force as opposed to their rational capacities. But humans, whose means of survival is their rational minds, that
That's a kind
survival
of,
tool is made impotent
but
when
they
you
don't have to be antithetical. So
violate rights.
you could have someone, so someone who comes and clears your bank account, they've managed to create quite a complex criminal. Like they managed to defraud you in a quite a complex way. Like I couldn't hack someone's bank account, for example. So like they've clearly used their rational capacities to do that to you, and engaged in, let's say, brutish violence in some respects. So I'm just wondering, like, if their reason is being, is working functionally and correctly, but yours is not in this situation by that standard. Why is it wrong?
So I would challenge the idea that their reason is working correctly. I mean, in a sense, you could say they correctly figured out how to hack into my bank account, but if are they correctly considering what's in their own long-term rational self-interest? I don't think they're correct about that.
Why?
Well, they're for it goes back to this question of how do you relate to other people? Is it in your interest to relate to other people as traders, trading value for value, or is it in your interest to relate to other people as a parasite on a host? If you try, as this hacker does, to relate to others as a parasite, where you're just sucking the lifeblood out of them without giving them anything in return, well, they have an incentive to stop that, to put an end to it, and come attack you, find you out, throw you in jail. So this person is now under threat of all that happening.
Yeah, but then they might be completely successful. They might for example, they might, like, there's people who are incredibly successful criminals their entire lives, and they live in a way which is pleasurable. They're under no real threat from others because they're so powerful. I'm just wondering, so for example, like this argument works for someone who is scared of pushback. Let's say they're scared of prison. Let's say the person that is involved is not scared of prison. They actually don't mind prison. Prison's not that bad for them. The risk isn't that great. The reward is a life of luxury. And they think that the likelihood of them getting caught is negligible. And let's say it is negligible because of the kind of crime that they are committing. They do it in such a way as to transverse legal boundaries in terms of like countries and stuff. And so it's a point of international law, which is complex. They would have to be hunted by Interpol. And let's say the amount that they've taken is small amounts from various individuals that are being funneled into a single account. So like they are own, like each case seems isolated, and each case is enriching them to the point in which, when collectively, they will become millionaires or something. There's not going to be as much, like if they were stealing 1 million at a time or something, there would be a lot more of a bigger manhunt. But in this case, like they know that the resources of each individual police department from the local vicinity are not going to consider this a major incident. So they've created this clever scheme. And even if they do get found out, they're in a place which is that has no extradition treaty to the countries that they're stealing from. So I'm just wondering, like, what places this individual in a situation where they shouldn't, where it would be irrational for them to do this?
Well, it sounds like you can dispute this, and we can get into it, but I think the person is building a house of cards. So they're doing all these minor crimes, I guess you're describing it as, but these add up. And a given incident, if it's the first incident, say very small, steal a few dollars, maybe the police think it's not worth looking into, but the more they do it, the bigger a problem it seems to be, and the more of an incentive there is for the police to track this person down. So the more they try to get, the more likely it is they're going to be caught. So that's one thing.
I feel like this is what we are relying upon here is some sort of the only thing stopping the criminal is the fear of punishment.
Well, that was the one thing. So I just said, for one thing, there are more. But the other thing, which I think is going more to the point you're just raising, is the internal psychological states. So this is where I think someone suffers on the inside, even if they're not caught. So you can't avoid being caught by yourself, knowing that you're acting in this way. Now, of course, you can ask the next question, well, why should you feel bad? And then maybe I'll bring up the point again about my own case. Well, I would feel bad, and then you can ask why, and I can try to unravel that and give reasons as to why.
Do you think that an individual will be irrational for not feeling guilt and remorse?
Well, I think I don't know if someone can be maybe if they're like a psychopath, they could do this without feeling guilt. But I think if they have a normal psychology, and I think a rational person would feel guilt. So why?
Yeah.
I guess that's yeah. Let me see if I can unpack it. So why would I feel guilty? I guess I've betrayed my own standards for how I should relate to other people. So I think it's best for me when I'm considering my long run interest, what's most conducive to my happiness and well-being. It's that I relate to other people as a traitor. And I violated that principle. So I've now put myself in the position of a parasite. Can I really respect myself? This is another point which I haven't brought up before, but I think is relevant. If you put yourself in the position of a parasite, you don't have the pride and self-esteem that comes from producing a value. You don't have the knowledge that, hey, I can support myself. I can survive on my own as an independent, autonomous human being. I'm dependent on others.
Yeah, but but you're always going to be dependent on others in some respects, right? But like look at it like
well,
this.
In a relevant respect, I don't think you are dependent if you're productive rather than a parasite.
Look at it like this. One, what would be wrong with being a parasite, right? Like you're assuming that the individual has a negative connotation with the notion of a parasitic relationship that very well might not. And then two, why would they see themselves as a parasite anyway? They might see themselves as like a commander or some sort of like mastermind. They might see themselves as like, typically people like psychopaths often refer to themselves as predatory. Like it's not that they are parasitic, it's that you are vulnerable and weak. Do you know what I mean? So like you're assuming that their psychology is already going to be, I am doing the wrong thing, when their psychology might be, I am being the best. Do you see what I'm saying? Like in a way which demonstrates their great irrational capacity in what they see as basically a chess game with the rest of humanity.
Yeah. I suppose if you're living in an anarchic sort of society, a war of all against all, then you perhaps in that sort of scenario, you could derive some kind of self-esteem by being the greatest conqueror. But if you're not in that sort of society, if you're in a society more like the United States or the UK, then I think your self-esteem would more plausibly depend on being able to be a producer yourself, support yourself, not live on the dole or as a parasite.
Well, no, like they're not living on the dole. So look at it like this, right? Like let's say they take this money and let's say they steal it from people and then they use that and they invest it in the stock market and make more money than all of the other people would have combined because they used it in a way which was more intellectual. They're actually a smart individual. Let's say they've got like an IQ of like, I don't know, 200 or some shit. They're ridiculously intelligent. They do everything financially correct with the money they get and they produce greater value from that. but they use other people's money to do it. And they even pay them back afterwards, let's say. So they go back and they're like, all right, I don't owe you anything now. I took it for a time. I used you then. Here's your money back. I don't even care.
Well, I think that would be better than not giving them money back, but I still think it would be better if they didn't take it without their consent to begin with.
I just don't see what's necessarily wrong. Like, I think there's a lot being done with the hypothetical that there is something like psychologically being induced when you do negative actions, which I actually agree with. I think I have a video on PITS disorder, like perpetration induced traumatic stress, that individuals seem to get from just killing animals, right? So when people see that they're doing wrong, they see that they're killing animals, they typically end up with a psychological condition revolving around that, right? When they're like they're murdering things all day long. So perpetration seems to have a detrimental effect. Now, I think that it has a detrimental effect because of how our psyches have formed. And I'm just wondering if you're going to make an argument in relation to the nature of the human psyche, which would show that it is irrational not to have these experiences. So, for example, some people don't get PITS disorder. Some people do not have negative experiences when they do wrongdoing. Like, there's a lot of people like that. And what is it? And when they do, and what is necessarily wrong about this variant psyche, and why?
maybe this connects to the issue of acting on principles, which may have been in the background implicitly in earlier parts of this discussion, but maybe it's worth addressing explicitly. So I think people who act in the sort of way which I think you're asking about, as parasites, murdering, raping, whatever, robbing, I question whether they're acting on principle as opposed to on whim. So I think this also connects to the issue of being long range. So I think acting on principles is a way of being long range, whereas acting on whim is not. So if you're trying to decide, like, what is the sort of way, what is the policy by which I should conduct my relations with other people? How should I relate to others, as a traitor or as a parasite? I think that's the level.
I mean, even why traitor or parasite is necessarily wrong in and of itself, right? Like, that's what we need to do. Like, so for example, you brought up whims there. Like,
Yeah.
I know Rand talks about whims, and she specifically says, what is it? A whim is a desire in which the desirer does not care to know the cause. I think that's the quote from Virtue of Selfishness. And in that, I'm pretty sure she points towards life. There is this sort of ontological foundation from which makes a desire correct or incorrect. And you need to understand what are your actual desires. And so an individual is simply not understanding themselves correctly when they engage in a whim over a rational desire. But what I'm wanting to know is, she says it's life. Now, I want to know what about life, or a life of the individual, or the ontological grounds of that individual are, so that they ought to feel guilt or ought to feel some sort of moral imperative towards others, and why, if it's only going to bottom out in pleasure. Like, if it's not going to bottom out in some sort of flourishing, like Aristotle would say, it's a completion of the individual, right? There is an ontological, grounded, teleological sort of foundation within the individual where you go, that is the end of human life. If you do this, you will not reach that end. So is there anything like that in Rand, or is it going to bottom out in you will feel bad? And if you don't feel bad, then what?
Well, I think it does bottom out and you will feel bad, in the sense that you won't be happy, or at least as happy as you could be if you didn't do these acts of parasitism.
Okay, so now why will it not make me happy? Like, what about this parasitic relationship necessitates that an individual will like by their nature, be incapable of a higher level of happiness?
I think because on principle, that's a self-destructive way of relating to other people. So when you're facing this question of how should I interact with other people as traitor or as parasites, I think only the former is conducive to a long run harmonious relation with others. The latter, you're putting yourself at war with others, and that can cause all kinds of problems.
Okay, so what you're saying is that this is so essentially it's the only thing that is stopping me from, let's say, living a good life as a murderer is the possibility that others will not harmonize with my position.
I don't know if that's the, I wouldn't want to say that's the only, but it's certainly a significant reason. You are definitely putting yourself at disharmony with others if you live as a murderer. And I don't think that's going to be conducive to your own personal happiness.
What about the German cannibal, you know, that was like, I want to eat someone, and then someone's like, yeah, I want to be killed and eaten? Am I
Never
not
heard of this
harmonious?
German cannibal who
Yeah, there was like
wants to eat,
he was like
who
a
wants to eat
Craigslist
others.
guy. He wanted to eat a guy, and then someone came forward and was like, "Yeah, I'll get eaten."
So someone volunteers to get eaten. I mean, if that's a very strange
I know it's strange.
case.
That's why I gave you.
I mean, if two people consent to something, should there be any limits to what they can consent? I'm not sure. Off the top of my head, I guess if we stipulate as this example that someone wants to eat others and someone else wants to be eaten, and that's the only way they can achieve happiness or pleasure, I guess, sure, they should do it.
No, but
I mean,
let's say
I
I
don't
was
think
to,
that's going to be very relevant to a lot of people, but
let's say like you were to groom and manipulate a whole class of society into providing you with cheaper labor or valuing themselves less. You know, they've essentially been raised as such to believe that they are less rational, less capable, less human. Um, things like that. Like why? Like I guess the point of this is that this is all reliant upon this hypothetical situation that a disharmonious relationship is necessarily going to end up with a worse conclusion for the individual, because if it does not, or even increase the likelihood of a worse relationship, you could have a slightly like and as well, why is harmoniousness being assumed to be non-violent? Like for example, Machiavelli makes a very strong case for why violence might increase social cohesion at certain points in time. So he could see, like, look, actually, society might not be at harmony with itself, and you could be bringing harmony into society by killing and mutilating and harming others to enforce your will, which might, and then force other people to harmonize with it. So why should I look at, let's say, me? Why should I look as a moral agent as externally I should harmonize with others rather than force them to capitulate and harmonize with me? Like in a Hobbesian sense, I am the sovereign, do as you're told, we are a group now.
yeah. I mean, if you really think, if you honestly think that your happiness is better served by raping, robbing, and pillaging and murdering, I guess you should do that.
Right.
I just
Okay.
don't
That's what
think, as an
I wanted
empirical
to
matter, I think you would be mistaken.
Right. So you think that it's not that there is any sort of rational principle behind it. You just think that you are probably mistaken. It's not it's like that. It's probably going to end badly. Like I 9 times out of 10 or something like that, and you're taking a risk. But you're not doing something
I think a lot
necessarily.
more than 9 times out of 10. um,
I don't know. Unfortunately, I'm
I mean,
not sure. It depends on where you are.
you can stipulate anything. Like if we stipulate that banging your head against the rock is the way to the most blissful happiness you could possibly achieve, should you bang your head against the rock? Well, yeah, okay, sure. But I just disagree.
I just don't think
that
that I think that this relies upon some sort of. I think there are a lot of horrible people that exist in the United States, in Great Britain, in Russia, that are of incredibly powerful positions that use and manipulate and harm others all the time. Um, why should I think that they are going to face some sort of retribution from the people? Like, I just, or that their life is going to crumble uh around them. I think this is the problem with Rand. I think even in this, I think that I have the only reason I have to believe that people are going to even do anything to me is because of the social paradigm we're in. If I change the social paradigm so that people don't seek retribution for violent crimes or collectivize or collectively work together for that, then I, in theory, could be undermining the harm done to myself from political consequence. All I just have to do is change the political system. I need to do what Machiavelli said and become the prince, so that I have this normative consequence where I perpetuate my will throughout the body of the public. You know, this idea of like glory, or what does he say? I think where basically the structure of society is formed by this individual. So like, I don't know, man. It just seems to me that this isn't a case for doing right and wrong. Like, the only reason that you care about others is as a means to an end anyway. It's that they are valued through yourself. And so the only thing that's preventing moral cannibalism is that people don't really like cannibals.
Well, I mean, speaking just for myself, I think it's in my own interests. So it's, I mean, I don't like moral cannibals, but I don't think it's in my interest to harm others in the way you're suggesting. I mean, so you talk about like,
Remember, I want to point out, I am not suggesting that you harm others. I'm actually a Hegelian Aristotelian. So I want to make clear, I would not do any of these things. I have no
okay,
intention of establishing myself as a tyrant, although I will be very mad at anyone who does not subscribe. And so if I ever do rise to power, just keep that in mind. But yeah, otherwise, that is.
so
Yeah.
I guess maybe we just have different views on how plausible it is that you could be a happy tyrant. So I think if you manage to put yourself in this Machiavellian position, I guess you're describing it as, where you get all the power for yourself. I think you're still at war, even if on the surface you're not literally fighting. I think there's always this threat. There's always going to be people trying to take you out, rebel against you, assassinate you. And so there's not really a harmony there. So I think it's just false that you would be in a state of peace and contentment if you've treated everybody else around you like garbage. They're all out going to be gunning for you now.
Not necessarily. I think actually, like, you got Stockholm syndrome. People actually don't react like there. I think
or
it's
a lot of them, at least, maybe not every single
no,
one, but
no. I think the majority of people, if you abuse them, will become more subordinate than rebellious. They'll become more docile. I think that's unfortunate, like, psychological truth about people. People don't like people, just because you're abusive and violent against them, it does not mean that they will become violent against you. And actually, in many ways, they might cower.
yeah, I can see how some people, they would just submit.
Yeah.
They would kind of give up, think their position is hopeless, and
as well, like, I guess the reason I'm kind of wanting to bring this is because the fundamental thing is like you said, like, if it actually is going to bring this person well-being, that's what they should do. There should be this rapist, murderer, blah blah blah. So you're doing what brings you the greatest pleasure over time. But how do you work out what is going to bring you the greatest pleasure over time anyway? Because that's the real crux. That's what I was hoping you would allude to with a question of human nature, rather than simply being harmonious about the pleasures that seemingly are given to you. I think, if I've understood Rand, I don't think Rand wants to say that anyway. I think that Rand wants to say that there is something indicative about your nature that makes some things positive and some things negative, and from that you can reason. But I could be wrong because I don't know Rand that well. As I say, I've got a very specific understanding of Rand. I mean, and as well, I think there is this issue of how do you reason your own ego when you are rationalizing from your own through, like, you can't see the eyes you look through, right? Like when you reason about your own mind, it seems misguided to believe that you have access to your essential nature, when your essential nature, as Lacan teaches us, is often only revealed in acts of speech or in actions which are observed from external to the individual acting. So I'm just wondering, like, why I have knowledge of what brings me pleasure, of what actually is good.
Okay, well, just there in the last minute or so, it sounded like maybe you were relying on some sort of, I don't know if it's Hegelian view of how we know things. So we might have some very deep differences, we probably do, on metaphysics and epistemology that might be getting in the way here. But I can say, from my point of view, or Rand's, as I understand it, how we come to know these sorts of things. So on Rand's view, we do have a biologically inbuilt pleasure pain mechanism, and we've just evolved in a certain way such that certain things give us pleasure and certain things give us pain, and that's not open to our choice. It's just no, it's not. At least on a basic level. Like if you're a baby and you're drinking the milk, well, you have no choice but to experience pleasure at that.
How does she account for masochism then?
Well, hold on. Maybe we can build up to that. But if you scrape your knee on a rock as a little child, you have no choice but to feel pain about that. So that, I think, provides a foundation. Maybe we should call it an objective foundation, where it's not just a matter of opinion that you feel these ways. It's just given to you as a fact of nature that you feel certain things as pleasurable, and that's what underlies our original concept of good. And you feel certain things as painful, and that underlies our original concept of bad. Now, I think as time goes on, we can extrapolate and be more sophisticated about it. For example, you go to a dentist and that causes some pain to have your teeth drilled, but you recognize that in the long run, it's going to cause you even more pain if you don't have this taken care of. Maybe it'll cause tooth decay and cause all kinds of problems. So you undergo some short-term pain in order to get a longer range pleasure or a more fulfilling outcome. So you can't just go by the immediate sensation of pleasure and pain and have that tell you everything you need to know about what's good and bad to do. But I think it's at least a good place to start. And I think plausibly the only place to start when it comes to getting a concept of good and bad. So now, if I think you take a long range view of your entire life, you'll come to see certain things as overall most pleasurable or most conducive to happiness, and other things as not. And connecting it back up to what we've been talking about in these sorts of discussions, I think that if you really think through these sorts of cases that you've been talking about trying to become a murderer or a dictator over everybody, I think if you consider all the consequences, short and long run, internal psychologically and existentially, the consequences of how other people are going to be dealing with you, I think you will conclude, or at least I conclude, that it's not in my best interest. And we've been struggling. I've been struggling, or we've been trying to see eye to eye on that, and I don't think we have yet, and maybe we won't. But that's at least the argument I would try to make, is that in the long run, it's not conducive to your pleasure and happiness to act in the
Okay.
sorts of ways which you've been describing.
But I mean, like, so for example, like you'd say that there was I'm assuming that what you're arguing is that there is a material foundation from which is positive and negative, which is inherent to our experiences in the world. So like it simply is that you are a human being who feels pain and pleasure when you are engaged with certain stimuli. Now, I think that that is somewhat correct. I think they are natural categories that exist within our essential nature, in the sense like obviously we all have the capacity for sensations from certain sensations. How we experience and value those sensations is psychologically, I would argue, structured and not inherent. So, like, for example, like what is painful and what is pleasurable isn't necessarily the result of some form of physical, purely physical phenomena. I think it's a psychological phenomena from how, or psychologically imbued phenomena. For example, this is where like Freud would talk about sublimation, where the infant, let's take like from a Lacanian Freudian perspective, an infant of before six months old, they would argue they lack, they haven't limited, they're spatially located and limited their experiences in the world, and they are doing it phasally through time as they come to control and understand aspects of their body. So, like for example, like they'll go through like the oral phase, they'll go through like the anal phase, the phallic phase, and so on, in relation to various pains and pleasures. And even then, when they engage with these stimulations, how they experience those is determined by how they relate to themselves, which is why you get masochism. For example, like the anal stage is heavily associated with masochism, right? Because you can gain pleasure from your own frustration. So what Freud is presenting is a human psychology in which the positive and negative stimuli themselves don't offer the bedrock of good and bad, but offer the modes of or offer the grounding of interpretation of what you will consider good and bad, because your judgment of good and bad is going to sublimate your desires and give them a form of meaning, right? It's going to bring that meaning through in which you will experience, which is why a masochist, even though many of us would be like, what are you doing? That looks awful. They'll be like, I'm having a blast, right? And they will be feeling pleasure. So how would you account for that? Like, how would you account for someone who seems to have all of the same physical stimulus, same reactions, yet says, I am having a good time rather than a bad time?
Yeah. So I think there are. Well, I just want to make this point. So I think there's the psychological analog to pleasure and pain. So if we call pleasure and pain physical, then in the emotional realm, you might think of joy and suffering as the analogs to pleasure and pain. So when you get a raise at a job, let's say, that can be a pleasurable experience, but it's not pleasurable in the way that, eating ice cream might be. It's not that physical sort of pleasure where it's just stimulating the senses, but you have this, it's a more mental kind of pleasure. You get this rush of mental pleasure from the news that you got a raise at the job. So in the masochist sort of example, it seems like
is it not
you're
the
saying
same? Like,
there's,
why do you think it's not the same? So what's the difference necessarily? Like, I mean, obviously there is the location of where the pleasure is. Like, you might have the same sort of stimulation, but in in many ways, like you, even in neurobiological terms, you release a lot of the same chemicals. So like for example, an individual who eats like sugar and stuff might have a dopamine release. An individual who gets a raise might have a dopamine release. Then there's obviously things like oxytocin, serotonin. These can be released through non-physical, like purely mental stimulation. Where the so I'm just wondering like why you would even separate them out. Like obviously there is the cause, the
yeah.
cause, but there's and even the pleasure might be different in kind, but is every pleasure not different in kind? Like is every experience of pleasure not distinct?
I think there might be something in common to so when you eat ice cream and when you get the news that you got a raise, I think both of those could have an emotional component, but I think maybe in the latter case, the case of the raise, it's only the emotional component. There's not also this other physical component of pleasure. There's in addition an emotion. Now there might be, something going on in the brain as dopamine release in either case. Like you might feel emotional pleasure as a result of the physical pleasure of eating the ice cream, but I'm doubting those are the same kinds of pleasure. I
But
think
this
you could
seems,
distinguish.
even if you were to distinguish them, it seems that they seem to be incredibly related anyway. So, for example, like the whole point of like like the libido, I think that like Freud and Lacan are putting forward, like the individual can have a libidinal response or not have a libidinal response, which will dictate how they are going to experience any physical stimulation anyway. Like, for example, if I was to um be raped versus have loving consensual sex, I'm going to have a vastly different experience based purely off psychological phenomena. Even if every single physical act was the same, my physical arousal, my ability to enjoy that physical sensation has been taken from me. Do you see what I mean? So I think that the connection between an individual psyche, like the structure of an individual psyche, and even the physical stimulus, like how do we tear these apart? Do you know what I mean? Where you go, oh no, you should be feeling, like it's not like I know you are being raped, but in reality, like you should have felt arousal. Like that would be ridiculous, right?
Well, I'm not sure that I doubt the physical state would be the same. Like if you're being raped, like, say if you're a woman and you're being raped, uh, maybe you don't lubricate as much, and you'll experience tearing in that region. Whereas if you were turned on, if then you
No,
would
I mean,
lubricate.
you could posit like a woman is like lubricated to hell, like the rapist is lubricated a woman to hell. I still think that she might end up having a there will be an intense suffering, like the act itself will be interpreted like like what would be like considered pleasure will be interpreted, I'm arguing, in a way that is not pleasure. Like the same stimulus, it feels like, as in even the stimulus itself feels like um what's the word I'm looking for, um a breach of her boundaries, like a breach of what she actually desires. And so this isn't a satisfaction, like, because I think that satisfaction is derived from desire. It is the desire, like the satisfaction, like the satisfaction only makes sense in relation to I am lacking something, and so I want it, and then my satisfaction is obtaining it. It's not like there is this sort of just random I think this lacks an understanding of why stimulus would even be considered positive and negative. Like, why do we even enjoy food, water, like warmth? It's not simply that this stimulation happens and therefore it's good, like I am experiencing some sort of ontological goodness. It's that my brain interprets these chemicals and I interpret these chemicals in a certain way in the first place. Do you see what I'm saying?
Uh, my mind is going to another point I want to make. I'm sort of getting what you're. Let me just make one other point, and then we can come back to this if I don't address it. But I think the physical stimulus is not the same in the case of rape. I think maybe it's more obvious in the male case. So if you're a male, you can get an erection. Blood is flowing to a certain region in a certain way when you're actually turned on. But if you're being raped, maybe you're not having an erection at all. Maybe there's not extra blood flowing to that region. Maybe the blood is flowing to your fight or flight muscles so you can fight off the person who's trying to rape you. So I think your internal physiology could be radically different in the two cases. So I don't
I
think
think you
we
could.
can just assume
I
that
think even
the
if you
physical
could,
stimulus is the
if,
same.
like, look, if you even what my point is that I think even if you did equalize all of those physical stimulus, like if you were to give someone Viagra or you were to give them some sort of you were to perform some sort of physical action on them that would force their body into a state of apparent arousal. I think that the individual psychology, one, the fact that they're not really meeting arousal itself shows that that the mind is having a reciprocal effect on the body in the first place. And that the body isn't necessarily, that pleasure is not being derived from the body, and that the mind and the body are actually like that. But regardless, even if the individual was forced into a state in which they are having the stimulation itself is being interpreted. Like it's information which is being interpreted. Do you see what I mean? So like, why do we interpret it one way than another? I think that's explained through psychology, not necessarily an evolutionary approach, or at least purely evolutionary approach. You could say obviously the capacity and the organs and stuff, fair enough, yeah, evolutionary. But like the actual experience and what it means to have the experience, I don't think so. I don't think that I can't tell someone what it's like to have ice cream by telling them the neurochemical response I've had, or rather telling them the chemical induction, the introduction of chemicals into my body and how it stimulates certain nerves, and then how that nerve stimulation will even affect the brain. I think is going to be based off things like anticipation, of more than what's just available in the physical stimulus. Do you know what I'm saying?
I certainly do think, I think we agree that there are two levels here. So there's the purely physical level, and there's also a psychological or emotional kind of level, we might call it.
I don't think I think that's the disagreement, actually. I think you want to say there's two levels. I think there's one level, and I think they're the same in the sense. Like,
well, I think they have an influence on each other, but I don't think they're the same.
Well, I mean, it depends on what, like, I think that what we are experiencing, like, it's at the point of experience in which they are synthesized, right? Like, that is the synthesis, the experience of the individual. But the stimulus themselves, or an individual's psychology without the stimulus, seems to be one-sided, right? Like, if I had no pain and pleasure receptors, of course, like I mightn't have any positive or negative stimuli, right? But like, I might have sensitivities. But just because I have sensitivities, it doesn't mean I can derive what is pleasurable and painful. And so that it causes me to posit the question really to you as a Randian, like, how do I understand what is good and bad for me? Do you see what I mean? If I can't just get it from a biological account.
Well, I think it takes introspection. So I think first you have to pay attention to what causes you pleasure and pain, and then later, as you mature, there's this other level, I'm calling it, this emotional level. You need to pay attention to what brings you joy and suffering, where by these I mean the more mental sort of thing, as opposed to the purely physical response to something touches you in some way. Or and I think if you introspect and think really seriously about, well, what causes me to experience positive emotions like joy, what causes me to experience negative emotions like suffering, I think that is what you need to do in order to figure out what's good and bad for you. I mean, that can take a lot of work. It's not easy. You can make mistakes along the way, but I think that's the sort of thing you need to be doing to figure it out.
So what would be the kind of mistakes that you can make? So you can obviously make the mistake of delayed gratification versus immediate gratification. I think that's the most obvious, where it's like, okay, like, this isn't indicative of pleasure over time. But is this mistake purely a hedonic calculus, is what I'm asking? Are you simply mistaken at what will bring you the most pleasure? Is that fundamentally it?
Is that... Maybe, I'm not sure. Let me see if I can give an example. So I think you can be mistaken about the causes of your pleasure. So let's say you're dating somebody and you're thinking, maybe you experience a positive emotion in response to this person, but you can be mistaken about its cause. Like maybe initially you think, oh, I really like this person because they embody some traits like honesty, which I really value. Um, but maybe that's a snap judgment. Maybe the real reason you like them is I don't know, they're from your hometown or something, and you have some kind of partiality towards people who are from a similar area. I don't know if that's a very good example, but the point is just I think you can be mistaken in identifying what reasons cause your emotions, and that's a way you could go wrong or be mistaken.
How would you respond to the experience machine then? Let's say you could get yourself, let's say you had enough money to get yourself like locked up in an experience machine and just fed dopamine for the rest of your life until you die. You're in a state of bliss. Like, is that good or bad?
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, this is Robert Nozick's thought experiment.
Yeah, and he thinks his response is specifically to say that he thinks people value being in reality. Now, I think that what you're saying is people value pleasure, and has nothing to do with anything with that, and that reality is a means to an end in some respects of obtaining the pleasure. So I'm just wondering how you would kind of
So I've actually debated this with some other people who are objectivists, and actually we've disagreed about this. And I think some of the people I've discussed with have thought I'm not an objectivist, maybe because of, or at least not in respect to this sort of issue. So with the experience machine, I'm not aware of a good reason not to go in it if we are stipulating that you can have a more pleasurable experience by going overall in the long run if by going into this machine. Now I doubt, as a matter of fact, we could actually construct such a machine, but setting that aside, if we're just going with the sci-fi sort of example and we're just stipulating you could have a happier, more pleasurable sort of experience in the long run, why not prefer that over the reality you actually live in? It's not clear to me that you shouldn't go in the experience machine. So it's
we just bite the bullet on that. Yeah, get in the machine.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. That's fair enough. I guess in terms of this, I guess my main concern is metaphysical. I think that I don't trust simply introspection. I think that people analyze themselves. When you analyze yourself, you often alienate yourself from your own knowledge. I think that knowledge itself, one, I think language is functionally intersubjective. The way that it functions is necessarily to rely upon individuals recognizing certain significations to a common domain, right? And that certain concepts or specific mental abilities are being used correctly or incorrectly in relation to a shared goal, right? That's what I would say. So, like, we're trying to build, like, in the kind of Wittgensteinian sense, if there's two people and they're trying to build something, one points at a brick and he's like, slab, and the other one's like, watching him do this, he's able to sort of rationally put together that, he wants the slab. And it sort of builds up, and, it builds up into a more complex functional relationship. But that ultimately my understanding of this being a slab comes from not just my indication of that thing, but of your recognition of my indication and the possibility of correcting my interpretive use of words. So I might say a sentence, and you might go, well, no, Lewis, you've used that word incorrectly. Or that I might have thought I might have an understanding of a word that is irrational and it doesn't make sense. And that this is why he says, like, it's like the beetle in the box sort of thing. There is or rather his argument against private languages specifically, that that the separation has to be from the interpretation and the rule, and that language is a rule-based structure, right? Where there are rules to how we use certain concepts, and those concepts allow us to essentially experience certain aspects of the world, right? Without the world I live in is linguistic in origin. It's phenomenal. It contains, like, I don't just live in a world full of like rocks and like pieces of wood and like sensory experiences. I live in a world which is conceptual, right? And I think that when we talk about the I, like having a conscious experience through time, the unity of my identity and how I understand myself, what I'm positing as good and bad, I think that is linguistic. And I think that the issue here is that you aren't going to find that your identity through introspection alone. You are going to have to rely upon intersociality. I'm going to have you tell me what is good for me in some cases, and I will tell you what's good for you.
Right.
Mutual
So
self-association.
yeah, I think we might have a deep disagreement here. Um, I I don't think language is essentially social, and I don't even know if I've read. I've certainly heard of. I might have read about Wittgenstein's private language argument, but I'm definitely not familiar with it. But based on my own way of thinking about it, which I think is consistent with Rand's, I don't think of language as social in the sort of way that you're making it out to be. I think we certainly learn words from other people, but I don't think in principle there's a reason why one couldn't have a private language. And I think something like pleasure and pain is experienced as good and bad independently of what others say about it or how others label it. I think that's just given as a
How
fact
would
of
you respond
our
to the
nature.
variant psychological states? Like even like what you take to be our nature seems to be, from what psychology has taught us, seems to be socio-politically constructed. Like as in my ability to experience positive and negative, like even the differences in, let's say, taste, like palates. It's not that Japanese people have different tongues, right? It's that they've been raised in an environment which has a different menu, right? Like it seems to sort of discount the individual's participation in what is and is not pleasurable. And it even seems to discount of what pleasure is metaphysically. Like, how do I describe what pleasure is without satisfaction, without the achievement of some sort of act of willing, of desire? It's like pleasure's not like. I think this turns pleasure into it divorces it from a telos, and that's what's concerning. And I think that a telos can be natural. You could have a natural one. You could say, all right, well, no, your body desires these chemicals. Yeah, to some degree. But then there is also a mental component to how these are interpreted. Like, do I interpret, let's say, like someone might take a drug and feel anxious and another excited simply because of how they interpret the heart rate. Um, so I think that in terms of in terms of introspection, I guess the main problems are for me is one, this seems to totally discount how people actually experience in the first place, and it seems to remove sort of essential components, I would say, like as in like essence from the scenario, where language is actually being used to posit an object as a thing to consciousness, and instead you're relying upon consciousness sort of presenting itself perfectly to itself, right? As if I'm getting some sort of infallible knowledge through introspection. And then two, it seems to rely upon a method from which I am incapable of validating or falsifying my own introspective methods. Like, how do I know whether I've analyzed myself correctly or incorrectly? Do you know what I mean? Like, where's the standard from which I can judge my introspection against? Like, am I thinking about myself right?
Yeah. Maybe something like Mill's methods would be a tool one could use to figure out if you're if you're reaching the correct conclusion. Like, to go back to the example of why you like this person, you feel something positive when you're around this person, but you're not sure exactly why. So maybe at first your thought is, oh, I like the person because she embodies the trait of honesty. But then you encounter this other person and you have some evidence that they're honest too, but you don't have the same kind of positive response to them, let's say. And now, using Milton's method of difference, maybe it is, you say, okay, well, maybe it isn't really honesty, since that same trait is in this other person, yet I have a different response. Maybe it's something else. Okay, let me think about that some more.
That's still not
And
going
then
to overcome the issue of interpretation, right? Because the interpretation is still going to be like, it's your understanding of the difference. It's your understanding of the similarity. It's your judgment that is being individuated and essentially being uncorroborated. Like, what judges the judgment? Like, what standardizes your judgment? How do we know whether you're judging correctly or incorrectly? Do you see what I mean?
I don't really see the problem. I mean, if you see the sorts of, if you observe the sorts of inconsistency, which I just noted, like you feel one way towards this honest person and a different way towards another honest person. So is that not sufficient to at least give you some evidence that maybe it's something other than honesty that I'm responding positively toward?
It's whether, like, so for example, your interpretation could be that in both cases that you are responding identically. In both cases. And that, or that you are responding in a totally different way.
So
so you could be in real life, in reality, you respond positively to one and negative to another, or positively to one because of you think that, or you might think that both are honest, or you might convince yourself that you aren't being biased. There is a separate alternative reason. Like, how do we measure whether your interpretive exercise is correct or incorrect? Are you interpreting correctly or incorrectly?
I mean, I don't see why you couldn't just continue this sort of Mill's methods of agreement and disagreement and concomitant variation. It's another one.
Necessarily unscientific. Like, so for example, this is like, it's like saying like, this is why, like, in psychology, they still have to do like blind placebo control. Like, even in normal science, right? Like, we don't just ask people like, how do you feel? Like, we have to go, like, like, we need some sort of objective metric. We need something to work out whether, like, the individual's interpreting themselves correctly or incorrectly. Do you see what I'm saying? You can't rely upon simply like, oh, what do you think about yourself? Most of the, I would say the majority of people misunderstand themselves. I would say actually everyone in some respects does not understand themselves correctly. And I think that if you were to rely upon introspection alone, I can see those problems even becoming exacerbated through an individual's perverse psychology. So if you have someone who, let's say they're a narcissist, and they're like, no, I'm judging correctly. And they're like, look, I've thought about it, and no, I'm actually, I'm even more certain I'm correct. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, I think, I'm not sure, but I think we might have different views of the reliability of introspection and maybe even what introspection is. So I know it's common among psychologists to discount introspection or downplay it or say it's very unreliable, and we need some other method to figure out what's true. From what I've read about their views, I think I disagree. I think introspection, properly understood at least, is a good and essential tool to figuring out what's true. I mean, it's our own minds. How else, what better way is there to figure out what you think about something than to reflect on it yourself? I mean, you have access to that, which nobody else does. So if you throw out introspection, I think that's a huge mistake. I'm not saying you're throwing it out.
I don't even say throw it out, but I think that even saying that alone. So like you said that you have access to something that other people don't. Fair enough. I will admit that. What happened? Do you not think that the reverse is true? They have access to you from which you do not have access to yourself. An objective third party position of analysis.
Yeah, they can see you from a point of view which you don't see yourself from. That's sure. It's
Yeah.
true.
So like in terms of like how you understand what is good and bad for yourself, do you think that introspection alone can be trusted when you don't have access to uh the full picture?
Uh, I don't know if I would want to say introspection alone, but so it might help you. I think it could be helpful to consult third parties. Maybe people are more experienced. They've lived long. I mean, if you're a child, that's part of what it's like to be a child. You know, your parent has had so much more life experience that they could help you out a lot in figuring out what is good for you. But I don't think it's in principle impossible for the child to figure it out. It's just a tremendous aid. So it's not like there's some metaphysical bar.
I think it's in principle impossible without the mutual aid of others to even epistemologically access your own well-being. I would say that, and that's not even including the fact that I think that metaphysically, I would argue that metaphysically, your understanding of self, as in like what makes you a human. When I use these words, language itself is made of universal components. When I say the word human, it relates to not just a single individual instance of a being, but it relates to beings through time and space. It's the same thing with chair, wall. All of these are universals. Language is complete, and I think in these universals. And not only do I think in these universals, but to understand myself as an I, when I say I limit myself to a universal. It's not that I am particularized. I don't go like I don't say I and it means like I don't go I, he, we, she. I don't go through variations of pronouns. Or every time I say I, the same person has another person has been born every 24 seconds when the neuron like when my like the energy in my brain changes like or discharges. There is a psychological continuation. And that psychological continuation is instantiated in my identity, at least partly, or at least my knowledge of that psychological continuation is instantiated in identity. So I think that it's one of those things where metaphysically, I would say that you are a universality, right? Like what makes you an individual. What individuality even is. What is individuality? Kant defines it. It's like what it means to be an individual is a limited universal. You want a particular because you transpire through time. Particulars don't, they perish. You want a universal because you're not all encompassing. You're not everything in existence. You are limited universality. You are something which is essentially a persistent form. And so to uncover the persistence of your form is to analyze universality and understand the limitations that are being self-implied or the limitations implied naturally to you, which might be spatio-temporal, like I live in my house and I exist in this life, but they might also be psychological. And these are core components of what makes me me, my universality and my particularity. And when I worry about this approach is that it seems to really heavily rely upon particularity, upon your particular experiences from moment to moment, rather than the universality of what it means to be a subject, an individual experiencing positive and negative, and why you are driven towards achieving pleasures and pain and avoiding pains and so on. It just sort of takes everything as a given.
I'm not sure I followed all that. It seemed like you might be bringing in a fair amount of Kantian or Hegelian premises there, which are quite alien to my way of thinking about this. I think you have a very deeply social view of individuals, I guess, which I don't share.
I mean,
So
even not even just social. I would even say that the individual is a manifestation of a universal substance. So I'd say that what makes you you is universal in origin, just as much as it's particular. Like I think that the Rand wants to say that there is this sort of fundamental material cause for the individual, and sort of implicitly points towards a empiricist metaphysic, which I would categorically deny. I would say that is incorrect, and I think that's the main
I'm
issue.
not sure what you
Like
mean.
how do we understand the self? The self in Rand is, from what I understand, is a derivative of a material nature. You are simply a material being, and how we understand the self is by analyzing this material entity, which is being called.
Let's just focus on part of this. You are a material being, so that doesn't to me sound like something. I mean, what in Rand, if you can recall, makes you think that her view is that we are, I mean, she certainly thinks we have a material aspect, our bodies, but she doesn't think that we are, or at least plausibly, I think one can interpret her as saying we also have a non-material aspect, our minds or our consciousness.
But yeah, but I mean, fair enough. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily know, as I say. I guess it's more about how she talks about it. The foundation is life, which would be fair enough. But it seems that she approaches life and a point of introspection and the point of analysis.
Wait, the foundation of what is life?
Foundation of, I think she says the foundation of, um, what she derives as the moral cause, or the cause of morality, or the cause of desires as life, and that this is the fundamental ontology from which we derive our understanding of what is good and bad in relation to ourselves. It is the fact that we are living organisms trying to achieve pleasure and pain, right? Like that's where she begins.
She does think the phenomenon of values depends on the phenomenon of life. That's correct. So
Yeah.
she thinks
But
only.
I'm just wondering, is this material? Like, is this, like, for example, like what, like, so when I said about how I understand my pains and pleasures, you said they do it through introspection. One mode was material analysis, another mode was um, psychological analysis, right?
Well, there's just different sorts of pleasure. So there's what you might call physical pleasure, the ice cream, eating ice cream, but there's also emotional pleasure, the pleasure of getting a raise at a job.
So in terms of epistemological, the epistemological method that is used, am I gaining this information through constant conjunction, is what I'm asking. Is it that, like, it seems that it happens again and again, that every time I eat ice cream, I have a good time? And is that how I gain information? Is it like inductive? And is that how you gain? What is Rand's epistemology specifically?
It's well, very broadly, she thinks one should follow reason as opposed to faith. So one should have evidence, but evidence for one's views can come in different forms. So we have the evidence of our senses, but we also have the evidence of introspection. Both of those are important and need to be used as a basis. I think induction also is a very important way that she reaches knowledge, principles. Actually, deduction presupposes induction. So
I would
if
I
you're
would
going to
argue
use a broad principle to deduce, to apply into a particular case, like all human beings, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So there you're doing a deduction. You're taking this broad principle, all men are mortal, applying it to a particular case. But where did you get the principle, all men are mortal, to begin with? Well, it could only be through induction. You had to observe
through induction.
through, well, this is at least the claim. So where else are you going to get your knowledge except she's an empiricist, so she thinks all knowledge is based on the evidence of the senses.
That's the thing. So I think she's an empiricist, and I'm about to
in that sense, at least.
kill empiricism again. So
So
like,
where
'cause
else are you going to get general principles from except from
so I would
the
argue for a
concrete
hermeneutic.
individual experiences you have?
I would argue for a hermeneutic approach. I think that you actually need to interpret those experiences. And anyways, I think that the fact that you think that you can abstract knowledge from reality is absolutely mistaken. I think Hume showed this in many ways, right? That you end up with this. If you affirm an analytic synthetic divide, if you affirm empiricism, you end up with an analytic synthetic divide where I don't know if my a priori concepts actually pertain to reality. There has to be a priori components within reality for my concepts to actually obtain too. So this is why, like, for example, Hume says there are two billiard balls on a table. One strikes the other. Where is the third term betwixt them? Why? Where's the causation? Why, when I see one event lead to another, why do I affirm causation? Through constant conjunction. And how do I justify constant conjunction? Because I think it might help me. There is nothing that in any way justifies induction unless you rely upon deduction, unless you can say that you can deductively argue. I mean, I wouldn't be induction anymore anyway. It'd be like abduction. But like you unless you can justify a deductive notion of science or a deductive notion of scientific analysis, I think you're going to end up really firmly in a point in which you cannot have knowledge of the external world. And I think Hume does that. He just tears it apart. It doesn't matter. Someone in the chat saying Rand isn't a human. It doesn't matter if Rand's a human. What matters is whether she's an empiricist and whether she can overcome the problem of induction. So
Rand has some very different fundamental premises than Hume, and I think that maybe challenging the premises Hume holds is a route to making induction seem more reliable. So if you start from Hume's premises, then maybe you will end up where Hume is on the issue of induction. But if you reject those premises, maybe not. So that's a very general kind of way of gesturing at what's going on here. So what are Hume's fundamental premises which lead him to conclude? Like, is it true that you need to be able to see what is the nature of causality? That's one issue. So if you can construe causation as one event following another event, well, is that what causation is? Rand has a more Aristotelian way of looking at causation, which is that things act in accordance with their natures. So a basketball has a certain nature such that if you drop it, it bounces back up. But an egg has a different nature such that if you drop it, it just splats on the floor. Now, everything in the world has a certain nature, and it acts in accordance with that nature. And
I mean, I would agree.
Understanding causality is understanding the different natures, the different properties of things that cause them to act in the way that they do. But I think Hume has a very different sort of way, maybe a different metaphysics, where there aren't really entities. So that's a pretty fundamental thing. There's just bundles of sensation with nothing holding.
He's a nominal.
Yeah, I think that's another fundamental.
I think empiricism can only be nominalism or conceptualism. It can't, you can't have a form of empiricism which presupposes an a priori aspect in reality and it be empiricist, because unless you were to, because for example, at this point, I think it becomes something closer to Hegel, which is objective idealist, or Aristotle. I would even say, there is no where there is a species or an essential nature which is not, which is there is a category, a concept in reality, right? As in every zebra contains the form of a zebra, the essence of a zebra, the substance. Right? Do you see what I'm saying? Now, if you particularize that to individual members, then it's either that. So, for example, Aristotle would see every zebra contains the universality of zebra-ness, and that the universal is more causative. It contains what it means to be a zebra more than any individual member of the species. It is the species, right? Now, Rand can't be saying that. Otherwise, I could make an argument about human nature or about the nature of being a moral subject that would mean that you should act in accordance with that which is universal and not that which is particularized. She's going to say, do what's individually good, not do what's good for the collective, right? So it can't be a universal nature like Aristotle. It has to be a particularized one. Now, that is going to be more akin to the nominalists and the conceptualists. So I'm just wondering how, I mean, I've got to go really, because I've got to catch the shop, and it's only been 2 hours. But like, as a final thing, what do you think would be Rand's response to that? So I know it's a very difficult question to ask, and especially one just before we go.
Well, maybe I can give an easy answer by saying she's written a whole book on a new theory of concepts. It's called Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, where she puts forward a theory of concepts which is neither nominalist nor conceptualist nor realist in the Platonic realist or Aristotelian realist sense. So it's an objective, we might call it the objectivist theory of concepts. And I think it's one of her greatest contributions to philosophy, but not nearly as well known as other parts of her philosophy.
Read that, so I can't comment on it. So I will give that a read. I'll go and have a look at it. I'll go give that a read. So what was that again? It was the
Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. I'm sorry to have to shoot off or anything. Yeah. It's been really fun. I'm happy to talk again in the future if you're interested. Obviously, we can kind of, because we've gotten like, I think about halfway through, I think what might, and I'll go and have a look at that book. Maybe we can discuss after I've had a look on Rand. I might come back and I'll be like, I'm a Randian, you know? Yeah.
Sounds great.
Yeah. If you're interested.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on. And if anyone's interested in seeing more of Dan, check out the description. His channel's linked. You've been nothing but a good participant, and I really appreciate your insights into Rand's philosophy. So thank you very much, Dan, and have a lovely day.
All right, you too. Thanks again for having me on.